Dr. Vanessa Mendez, thank you so much for joining us on the Plant Trainers podcast today.
Thank you guys for having me on. I'm honored to have you to be here as one of your guests, and I'm excited to talk about this exciting topic.
We're very excited too, and we've been waiting to have you on. We love what you're doing out there in the world. And before we begin, we wanted to know if you have a moment of gratitude to share with us and the listeners.
Absolutely. I love to start my days by just opening my eyes and expressing gratitude. I think today I woke up and I was just grateful to be able to enjoy a bright sunny day outside, enjoy time with my family, and get in much needed relaxation time this weekend.
Relaxation time is definitely something that is needed. It's something that everybody should be grateful for. And I think sometimes we take it for granted and we're like, okay, relax. But when you take that time to say, thank you, universe, for giving me that time with my family, that time with myself, that time to wind down, I think that you can come back with full force and get the things done during the week or the rest of the week done that you really need to.
It's also super important to get outside, like you just mentioned, and get some fresh air. A lot of us are still cooped up in our homes very often these days, and getting outside to move your body, to get some fresh air is super important and something to be grateful for as well.
Absolutely.
So we would love to hear about your story of how you found a plant-based lifestyle and what that did for you personally.
Absolutely. So I think that growing up, I experimented with diet. I never did like fad diets. I think the longest I ever did like the Atkins or South Beach diet was like 4 days, and I was like, oh no, I can't eat a banana. Like that's ridiculous. So in high school, I actually suffered from cystic acne, and I went through the regular channels. I saw a dermatologist and they prescribed antibiotics, and then the antibiotics, would help, but it was only a temporary fix. And then it got to the point that I was prescribed Accutane. So Accutane is a very, very strong anti-acne medication that you actually have to monitor, elevate like liver enzymes, cholesterol levels, because it'll just send them all out of whack. So I was put on Accutane. Eventually, I think that medication actually got recalled, or there were like class action suits, some ridiculous stuff like that, because it was actually associated with inflammatory bowel disease. So it's been linked to increased risk of inflammatory bowel disease. At that time, I saw that, yes, the Accutane helped, but then the acne would again come back. So I started researching on the internet, and this was in the late 90s, early 2000s. Yeah, early 2000s. And I came across like an anti-inflammatory diet. I think it was Dr. Wheel's diet at that time. I am not 100% sure, but I came across that diet, and it said, stop eating red meat, stop consuming like animal hormones, etc. And stop eating dairy, for example. And I stopped that. And my acne went away. So I basically saw first line the effects of switching my diet, going more whole foods and eliminating animal products at that time. And it did clear up my acne. And my acne never actually went back to being that way. I stayed pretty much dairy free throughout the rest of my life, except here and there. And then, you go to college. College basically messes you up in all sorts of ways. And I left all those good habits that I had incorporated into my life. So I went through my regular medical training, and we were never taught about nutrition. It was a traditional medical training, etc. Until I got to my fellowship in gastroenterology. And then my fellowship, midway through my fellowship, we were in New Orleans, Louisiana. And I like, this is the rest of my life. This is my career. So what was I learning? I was learning to prescribe medications, and my patients, would feel a little bit better, but they were still obese. They were still suffering from all sorts of medical conditions. So I was able to improve their heartburn, for example, or their constipation with medication, but the rest of their health was suffering. So I didn't feel like I was making a dent in their health. And personally, me and my husband, we were eating a standard New Orleans diet, Louisiana diet, Southern American diet at that time, high in cheese, high in saturated fat. I think we started exploring, researching, and we came across what we all come across, like documentaries like Forks Over Knives, What the Health, and we started really digging very deep into it. I think about a week or two after that, I said, I can't do it like halfway, like it has to be like a real transition, right? Like a real and abrupt, because I can't live in this limbo. Because originally we had said, oh, we're going to transition slowly, etc. But we decided, let's clean out our fridge, let's clean out our pantry, let's donate, and let's just start fresh. At least here at home, we're going to do this. So we dove deep into that, and we're still living in Louisiana, so it was hard outside the home, but at least inside the home we had full control. So that was when we first started transitioning, and that's going to be 3 years ago this June. And since then it's been great, because actually my husband, he suffers from inflammatory bowel disease. He was diagnosed when he was 17 years old. He has Crohn's disease. And it's an aggressive Crohn's, because he was diagnosed very early on, and he required surgery. He was put on mega doses of biologic therapy, which is like a chemotherapy style medication to control these patients. And he had been on those medications for like 13 years and still never achieved remission. So he was still struggling. And as a Cuban American, he wasn't able to eat the foods that he wanted to eat, like beans. He loved beans, and he would watch us eat beans, and he would suffer. He's like, can I just have a bite? Every time he would eat beans, he would get obstructive symptoms, like horrible abdominal pain. He couldn't go to the bathroom, etc. And that was all on this mega doses of biologic medication. So when we did the transition, a year into our transition, he had another colonoscopy, and for the first time ever, he was declared to be in remission. And that was continuing his medical therapy, but doing these drastic lifestyle changes and nutrition changes. And for the first time, he was declared to be in remission. So all of a sudden, he was able to enjoy like a pot of beans. And he's been the happiest person to be able to enjoy and thrive on fiber, because he loves his fruits, his veggies, and those amazing Latin and Cuban beans. So that was like the first year of our transition into a plant-based diet. We saw it with our own health, and we saw it and I saw it with my patients, because then I started counseling them on the same changes I was making, and they were dropping the weight, they were dropping the meds, and all these wonderful changes that we know can happen when somebody is on a plant forward or a whole food plant-based diet.
There are so many good points in the story, and I'm so happy for you, and I'm so happy for your husband. And the joke that comes to my mind is that you're so lucky that a pot of beans is the way to your husband's heart. But there's so much more in there. And I think one of the things that people need to realize, and people will come to us and say, I've been plant-based for 2 months. I've been plant-based for 6 months. I've been plant-based for a year. How come I'm not getting all the other results that everybody else online is getting? So I think the fact that it took your husband a year to really get those results is huge, and a really important lesson to all of us listening, and for us to share with other people who are kind of like, how come the weight's not falling off after a month or two? We've all got different bodies. We've all got a weight. But, the fact that, Crohn's can be very scary for people, right? You have enough surgeries, you don't have enough colon left, and there's other things that need to happen next. So the fact that you can put that in remission, keep that in its tracks, yeah, maybe he needs to be more careful than other people going forward the rest of his life, but that's still so much better than what maybe would have happened if you would have stayed on the standard North American Louisiana diet.
Absolutely.
The other thing is that so many people with Crohn's say, oh, I'm not allowed to eat fiber. I'm not allowed to have beans. I'm not allowed to have fruits and vegetables because that causes more irritation. Can you speak to that and tell us what's really going on inside the body and microbiome to create that kind of problem? Or is that really not what they should be doing? They should be eating the fruits and vegetables. And how does that work?
So I love this question because apart from being a gastroenterologist, I'm actually an inflammatory bowel disease specialist, probably prompted by, my husband's journey, because we actually met when we were like 12 years old. But so there's a lot of different issues at hand when it comes to fiber and gut health. So first of all, our gut microbiome, and we can define this for people. Our gut microbiome is the 100 trillion microbes that live in our gut. And everybody's gut microbiome is completely different, completely unique, like our own unique fingerprint. We all have weaknesses and strengths in our own microbiome. So that's, part of the reason. We also all have different genes, right? So one of the jobs of the gut microbiome is to actually turn on and off genes. So that's one of its main functions. The other main function is maintaining digestive health, maintaining the integrity of the digestive wall so that toxins and microbes that shouldn't cross into our body. Another important function is immune system. The gut microbiome is in constant communication with our immune system. And in fact, 70 to 80% of our immune system resides in our gut. And it's just a tiny little cell away from the gut microbiome. So they're in constant communication. And when we talk about gut microbiome development, which we will in a few minutes, you're going to see that actually that early life experience is really priming the gut microbiome, but also our immune health and determining what's going to be the rest of that life for the child and the adult. So many other functions of the gut microbiome include immune, not only immune, but metabolic function, processing of nutrients, and communication with our brain, actually, through the gut-brain axis and through the production of things like short-chain fatty acids and certain other byproducts. But what people don't realize is that us as human beings, we can only digest a small part of carbohydrates. We actually don't produce all the enzymes to digest carbohydrates. So we rely incredibly heavily on the gut microbiome to help us digest complex carbohydrates. That's one of their main functions. They digest, ferment complex carbohydrates, and that is the energy that they use for themselves. Most of that digestion stays in the gut, and they use that fuel in the form of short-chain fatty acids to maintain the colonic wall and the digestive system intact. And a certain percentage of those short-chain fatty acids, which are byproducts of the digestion of complex carbohydrates, actually circulate throughout our body and to try to maintain health throughout the rest of the body and keep inflammation at bay. So the fact that we rely so heavily on the gut microbiome to digest complex carbohydrates is the key in why a lot of people feel like they cannot digest fiber and plants. Because if we have a weakness in our gut microbiome, we're not going to be able to digest complex carbohydrates like somebody who has a stronger gut microbiome. But that doesn't mean that we should avoid them completely, which goes to your question. That means that we should really work with somebody who's qualified in plant-based nutrition and in gut health to get us to the point, like my husband, that you can actually thrive on the hardest plants to digest, which are usually beans, right? And legumes. So it's a gradual work, and it's a very individualized and personalized approach to strengthen a patient's gut microbiome, because everybody's gut microbiome has weaknesses because of different reasons. And it's not always purely nutrition. Yes, nutrition is a huge aspect of it, and it has to be part of that intensive work we do with the patients. But it also takes into account chronic stress. Chronic stress changes our gut microbiome drastically. And it decreases the diversity of our gut microbiome. Diversity is key, because the more diverse our gut microbiome, the more we're going to be able to digest all those amazing complex carbohydrates, and the more healthy the gut is going to be. And the diversity comes from our lifestyle and our nutrition. But yeah, so the question should patients with inflammatory bowel disease avoid fiber? They should really work with somebody who's qualified and based on their specific disease, right? Because inflammatory bowel disease is a whole like spectrum of disease. You have patients with ulcerative colitis where only their colon has inflammation and only their colon is involved, right? So that means that actually most of the digestion and absorption of nutrients which occurs in the small bowel is going to be happening fine, you know, as opposed to somebody who has Crohn's disease and has small bowel strictures, narrowings in the small bowel, where actually food is getting stuck, can't go through. So those patients, we have to be very careful in how we, you know, gradually introduce a plant-based diet, because if they just eat like a raw vegan diet, for example, they're going to get an obstruction. So I personally have a protocol for these patients, and it relies heavily on using what I call pre-digested foods in the form of soups and smoothies. Soups and smoothies are my favorite go-to food for patients with digestive disorders that cannot tolerate a high fiber diet. Because you can get so many different diversity and variety of nutrients and plants in there, but in a pre-digested way, right? So the smoothie, it's blenderized, so it's broken down, so pre-digested. And then in the form of a soup, it's cooked, but it's also, I recommend blending it as well. So that way, you know, we transition these patients gradually like that, and according to their own specific profile, and then we get them eventually tolerating whole foods and even raw veggies and fruit.
That's such a dream and so wonderful for so many people out there. When you talk about, you know, pre-digested foods, it makes me think of the mama bird that eats first and then gives it to the babies. And it's kind of the same way. I guess she's teaching, it's making me think, like, why is that happening? She's teaching the babies to eat so that they don't choke on it, but maybe there's certain enzymes that baby birds don't create and can't break down the food properly, so she does it for them. So you're making me think on a tangent here, but yeah, it's super interesting. And, you know, because it's unfortunate because it's the foods that you can't digest with IBS that's going to heal your IBS. You just need to do it in the proper way.
Yeah, absolutely. So what happens is that most patients get into a cycle, a very toxic cycle of food avoidance and food restriction. And because it's causing them symptoms, and because most medical professionals actually don't know how to walk them through it. And even today, we have gastroenterologists and other medical doctors recommending a low fiber diet for these patients. And that's not the way to do it, right? That they really should be deferring that to registered dietitians that know more about gut health and plant-based nutrition, because once we create that cycle of food avoidance, we're only worsening our gut microbiome. So our gut microbiome is made up of all these different microbes, right? Viruses, bacteria, fungi. Yes, we have funguses in our gut, okay? Which is another huge topic, the whole Candida issue, but and different other microbes that make up our gut microbiome. We all have beneficial ones that are called probiotic species. They are called probiotic because studies have shown that they confer a healthy response in the human body. And then we have inflammatory, pro-inflammatory, and potentially pathogenic microbes. We all have good and we all have bad. It's not black and white, because under certain conditions, actually, the good ones can turn a little bit bad, and the bad ones may actually have beneficial functions within the body. But we like to just simplify it for the public in this way. And what we do know is the probiotic strains, the ones that are beneficial, all those good gut bugs that help us do all the functions we mentioned before, they thrive on complex carbohydrates and plant-based and fiber. Fiber comes from plants and they thrive on fiber. That is their fuel source. They use that fiber, they digest it, they ferment it, and they create several metabolites. One of the most commonly known are these short chain fatty acids that we talked about that are anti-inflammatory, that keep our digestive system in tip-top shape, but also circulate throughout the body. Now, the pro-inflammatory microbes, the pathogenic ones, their energy source, their fuel source is things like saturated fat, processed foods, refined sugar, and energy drinks. So they use those foods, and that's their energy source. So when we talk about health and gut health and overall human health, it's not only about incorporating these more fiber into our diet, but it's also decreasing all these inflammatory products in our diet. So while we're increasing one, we're decreasing the other. That's going to shift that balance in the gut microbiome from a pro-inflammatory gut microbiome to one that is health promoting. And you know, it's all working together, right? And the nutrition aspect, but also the lifestyle aspect as a whole.
So tell us what happens when we take antibiotics. Do we wipe out everything and have to start again?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So every antibiotic focuses on different strains. So for example, some antibiotics focus on what we call gram-positive. It's a certain strains of bacteria. Others focus on target gram-negatives, and others focus on anaerobic. So we have different types of bacteria in our gut, and each antibiotic focuses on a different strain. So if you take one antibiotic, it's going to focus on that strain. If you take two antibiotics, which sometimes in severe infections we need to take two antibiotics, it's going to wipe out more different strains. Now, does that mean that those strains are gone forever? Will they never come back? No. So that is the exciting part, actually. So our gut microbiome has something called the resistome. Okay, they resist being wiped out. So both the bad ones and the good ones have it, right? So when we say antibiotic resistant bacteria, yeah, the bad ones have it too, but the good ones have it too, which is the exciting part. And this is something that, in our field, people are like, oh, once you take all these antibiotics, you wipe out all the gut microbiome, you're done. Well, it's not true. So they have genetic material, this resistome that allows them to come back. So they're there. They're just waiting for the right conditions to do their comeback. And our job as human beings and as their host, right? Our body is their host, is to create the ideal scenario or a better scenario for them to do their comeback. So yes, the more antibiotics we take, especially in early life, the more, we're going to be changing our gut microbiome in a way that may be harmful to us. So it's so important to work with somebody that really does intense microbiome work to bring that gut microbiome back, but it can come back. And that is the good news.
So if there were someone who was on antibiotics about once a month for the majority of their first 30 years of life, by the time I was in my 20s to 30s, it was like, maybe it was 8 times a year. So it was better at that point. What do they need to be careful of as adults? Or if they go on a whole food plant-based diet and feel great and get themselves back to normal, will that negate their whole first half of life, or will there still be side effects or things to watch for?
So I love that question. So thank you for sharing your personal health journey. So I empathize because because when I had that acne, I was on antibiotics for months, and then I took Accutane, which has horrible effects on the gut microbiome. So that is your personal health journey, and that is your microbial health journey that you just described. So your microbial health journey is going to result on a gut microbiome that is completely unique, right? A completely unique and different from somebody, like if you had a twin, for example, that hadn't taken those antibiotics. What to watch out for, it all depends on how you're feeling. If you are feeling like you still have, and we're all a work in progress, right? So if you're still feeling like you have certain aspects of your health that you want to improve, then definitely, then that is a signal that your gut microbiome needs a little bit more encouragement, a little bit more changes, a little bit more diversification, maybe more time in nature. Let's check in with your stress levels, all these different things. So definitely, you know, we're all a work in progress. We can always optimize our gut microbiome a little bit more. So this is what I do. I really take a history and I break down a patient's like profile to see where the deficiencies are currently that we could optimize, because we cannot undo the past. The past is the past, and we are working with this material that we have in front of us. But what can we do right now? Where are the weaknesses in our lifestyle that we can work on and improve? But yes, I mean, we all have weaknesses in our gut microbiome. Nobody's gut microbiome is perfect because we live in a human world. We're exposed to environmental toxins. We're exposed to all these different stressors to our gut microbiome. And you know, even somebody that looks like they're in perfect health, they have outwardly an amazing appearance, they could definitely be having symptoms and be struggling. All of us have things that we are, you know, working through. So so I don't know if that answers your question specifically, but if you want to specify it more.
No, I think there's just lots of people wondering, if I've been on antibiotics a lot in my life, and you know, is that going to affect me forever? What about fecal transplants? If you're saying that no two people are alike, and for those people not on YouTube, Adam's shaking his head. If there's no two people alike, does that help the microbiome? And is that something that you'd ever recommend?
Yeah, so the data we have right now is driven more towards, so fecal microbiota transplants are basically when you transplant, and the recommendations are to transplant a family member, somebody who's living with you, their gut microbiome into your gut microbiome. So from their colon into your colon, if you have a condition called Clostridioides difficile, so C. diff, C. diff infection. If you have recurrent C. diff infection, this transplant of fecal material from another human has really been shown to be amazingly revolutionary and in treating the disease, which could be potentially life-threatening, and in many instances is in very sick patients, like hospitalized patients, nursing home patients, etc. And it has actually been shown to prevent C. diff. So C. diff is a bacteria that we all, not all, 20% of us have in our colon, but most of us are not developing the infection. Why? Because we have all these other health-promoting microbes that are actually keeping that C. diff under control, which is one of the most important jobs of the gut microbiome, which we didn't say before. It's actually creating all these different chemicals and enzymes to keep the bad ones under control and in check. When somebody's immune system is low, or when they're very sick because they have heart disease or kidney disease and or diabetes, obesity, etc., then the good gut bugs, we know that patient's going to have an imbalance in their gut microbiome. So they don't have the microbial army to keep the C. diff in check. So the C. diff grows, it proliferates, and it takes over the colon, causes a huge inflammatory reaction in the colon that could lead to sepsis, which is basically your organs are failing. You cannot maintain your blood pressure, your heart rate is sky high, and you're near death. So fecal microbiota transplant was developed for this, and it's currently, I believe, FDA approved or conditional approval, but it's being used. Because of COVID, we've had to halt that in the last year and a half because we know that COVID exists in the stool. So now we've had to halt those studies. But I believe in COVID negative and in certain scenarios, it's still being done. That's really the only condition. It's also being studied in inflammatory bowel disease, but right now it's showing possibly good results in ulcerative colitis, but not so much in Crohn's disease. And it really hasn't been approved for anything else. And again, I think the approval for C. diff, it's conditional or it's just an emergency use. So correction on that.
You don't book it like a facial.
Right. But a lot of people do it themselves. They'll do like fecal transplant colonics on themselves. And that is potentially really dangerous, because what the studies actually show us too is that it, when you transplant the microbiome or, a fecal transplant to somebody else, you really don't know where you're transplanting, right? Because that person has their own gut microbiome. You're transplanting these strains that you think are going to be good for them. But what about if you transplant some strains that are associated with, for example, anxiety or depression? So we have seen studies where actually, or obesity, for example, we've seen studies where these fecal transplants actually induced weight gain in the recipient, the person that received it, or induced depression on them. So we have to be really, really careful. So and this is the future of medicine. The future of medicine is, and hopefully will be there in the next 10 years, is that based on your own unique genetic profile, your own unique genes, right? And your own unique gut microbiome, which turns on and off those genes, we are going to tell you exactly how to thrive, what nutrients are going to be superfoods for you, which plants are going to be the best ones for you, which exercise is going to be the best for you, what type of de-stressing techniques are going to be the best for you. So the future is getting your genetic profile, getting your microbiome profile, and then being able to tell you where to go from there. And actually, that will create personalized medicine, where in that scenario, we could potentially tell you, hey, this probiotic supplement may work for you. But we are not there. We're nowhere near there at all. And that brings me to the whole probiotic talk. If you want to talk about that, I'm happy to do so.
That's very interesting stuff. Happy to talk about probiotics if you'd like to.
But before we talk about probiotics, maybe we can take a step back, because you mentioned COVID. So I was wondering if getting COVID itself affects your gut microbiome and what you might need to do to build it back up after that. Because it's viral, and you don't take antibiotics for it, but it must affect the system.
So yes, so we see both. So there's actually several studies already published on COVID and the gut microbiome. So initially, the study that was published showed that getting COVID infection, and what people don't know is that the COVID virus actually binds more profusely to our gut than our lungs. So people think, oh, COVID is a respiratory disease, but there's more ACE2 receptors in our gut lining than there are anywhere else in our body. So and that was shown early on because it showed that people shed COVID in the stool. It was noticed in the water systems in certain cities. So they were able to determine what percentage of the population actually had gotten COVID, asymptomatic in most cases. But so we know that COVID binds to the ACE2 receptor in the digestive system. And yes, COVID does change the gut microbiome. In fact, we think that this is one of the leading issues in these long hauler situations. So long hauler means you may have had severe COVID, may have had moderate or mild, or maybe even an asymptomatic COVID. But what happens is that long term, you're feeling off. One of the most common symptoms is brain fog, fatigue, inability to perform, like for example, physically, the same way that you were able to perform before, food intolerances, in a whole host of issues. Yes, changes in mood, and hormonal changes, especially thyroid issues. So long haulers are really these patients that we're still actively studying because they're having so many complications. It looks like an autoimmune response. And it's linked to the gut microbiome, no doubt about it, because autoimmune disease is linked to the gut microbiome. So these patients that are long haulers, they show a microbiome dysbiosis, which is in that imbalance in the gut microbiome, a decrease in the beneficial, health promoting microbes, and an increase in the inflammatory ones. So that's the first study that came out. Now, the more recent studies actually showed that your pre-existing gut microbiome, the one that you came with and then you contracted COVID with, does if you have a microbiome imbalance to begin with, your risk of getting severe COVID, being hospitalized, intubated, and even dying from COVID is way higher. So an existing microbiome imbalance or dysbiosis increases your risk of having severe COVID or dying from COVID. So both ways are being shown to actually be at play. And it's fascinating stuff. So the question is, how do we recover that gut microbiome, right, in these long hauler patients or patients that have recovered from severe COVID, and we know that it messed up their gut microbiome, for example. We work with them to reintroduce healthy habits, right, very, very gradually, because a lot of these patients are incredibly fatigued. They cannot go for a walk. I have a case of this crazy case of a patient that I believe he had underlying digestive issues, but he was a whole food plant-based, which had led him to go whole food plant-based, and he was a marathon runner. And then he actually didn't really have any symptoms when he got COVID, but then developed long haul COVID, and still working intensively with him. Because after he developed long haul COVID, couldn't walk more than a mile, couldn't walk a mile. And this was incredibly debilitating for him mentally, because in New York City too, which we know, you have so much limited space and outdoor space. And I mean, they were hit one of the cities that was hit the hardest, emotionally and in terms of COVID numbers too. So this is a patient that me and my RD work intensively with to help, but it's a long road ahead, because this is just something we've never seen before. So definitely not to scare people, but to really optimize the whole situation with your health and your gut microbiome, so that we can best be prepared to deal with this.
As more and more people get vaccinated for COVID, does that have an impact on their microbiome as well? And if so, is there something they need to do for that?
So that is actually one of the most exciting developments actually in the last 2 weeks, that we are seeing that people that get vaccinated, actually their long hauler status improves. So that is incredibly exciting, something that I never even foresaw, as a quote unquote microbiome expert. I mean, that brings tears to my eyes, because I do believe strongly in vaccination. I think it has to be a very informed decision that you have to make for yourself. I think nobody should be enforcing that on you, but you really have to get the facts, not misinformation, but the facts about whether this is best for you. I strongly believe in it, and I think it's saving tons of lives. But this is unprecedented, that this could potentially actually modulate the long hauler response. So that is still in developing news. So I'm really excited to see what's going to come out of that.
Wow. I mean, I don't listen back to every podcast, but I'm going to have to listen back to this one. I feel like we almost have to have you on. Do we want to go into the probiotic, the prebiotic now, or do we want to wrap up? What do you want to do?
I don't know if we have enough time to do that.
I'd be happy to come on again. I'm excited to talk about this, because this is an ongoing, all of these are ongoing topics. We're getting research and data alerts on a weekly basis. And I think for families out there and adults, I think we have to have a whole other episode on really what are the steps to, one, how does the microbiome develop? For families, it's really important. Women that are looking to get pregnant, moms. This is stuff that I learned after I had my son. So I wish I had known all of this stuff before. But yeah, I think, and all the action steps, really going deeply into each action step to improve our gut microbiome.
Yeah, we should totally get you back on to do that. So Dr. Mendez, where would you like people to reach out if they want to connect with you in the meantime?
Yeah, so the best place is actually my website. So my website is dr as in doctor, drvanessamendez.com. I encourage people to subscribe because I send out latest podcasts on there. I send out blog posts on there. My website also has access to a gut health guide. I really recommend that gut health guide because it's a 43-page guide for families and individuals on really topics that, one, how to add more variety of plants to your diet, whether you're plant-based or whether, you want a healthier life. Really, every spectrum of health would benefit from that. But I also talk about things like emulsifiers. Emulsifiers are these additives in foods that are incredibly damaging to our gut health and have been linked to things like inflammatory bowel disease. So I encourage people to check out the Gut Health Guide. It's on my website. And I'm also really active on social media, on Instagram. It's a kind of like a passion project of mine because as a medical doctor, I feel like that 30 minutes I have with a patient, one, it's not enough. And two, I actually want to reach way more people. And I've been able to do that through social media. I cater to families, individuals, really to everybody to improve their overall health, but also add more variety of plants to their diet. Also for, families and kids. But also I cater to a Spanish-speaking audience. As a Cuban American, I think it's really important that we provide all this information for free to our audience, our audiences of color. So those are my little passion projects. I'm also available for private consultations for families and individuals looking to improve their health. And it's virtual, so it's accessible to a lot of people.
This has been amazing. We are going to link to all of that you said in our show notes at planttrainers.com. And we are so grateful for your time, for your expertise. You are a microbiome expert. This conversation was above and beyond what I had expected. And I'm super excited to have you back on to talk about some of those other topics. It'll be interesting.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mendez, for being here on the Plant Trainers podcast.
Thank you, guys.